World of Warcraft, like many games, has multiple sides of the coin to its gameplay. You have three primary pillars of the game to get involved to, and in my opinion, you shouldn't have to play one in order to enjoy the others, if that particular pillar is to your distinctive taste. Allow me to elaborate on this a little bit more. Essentially, these pillars are roleplay, player versus environment, and player versus player, and they should be able to be played without much or zero help from the other ends of the spectrum. For roleplay and player versus environment, I'd say those can be played reliably on their own. You don't see too many people going into PvP or gearing up to PvE due to the fact that it's so reliable to go in and simply get gear from world quest, dungeons, raiding, and so many other environment heavy aspects of the game. On the other side of the spectrum, you have roleplay. And roleplay is its own identity in the game to a point where you really can't use the other sides of the game in order to help on it. This pillar requires a bit more in the grammar, social, and lore involvement to go in and actually enjoy. But then you look at PvP, and you see that there's quite a difference in the way that this style of content is played out versus the other pillars of this game. And notably, it has a lot more people flocking to PvE content in order to gear up for this aspect of the game. And in my opinion, this should not be. Honestly, there are several problems with the player versus player environment, spanning from a lack of changing content to just how much you can actually play the content as a standalone part of the game. I'm going to focus much more on the latter part, as this is my biggest problem with the game, but let me go ahead and address the former, as it seems to me that some people will likely want to understand just why I dislike and have almost pretty well stopped PvPing in World of Warcraft. You see, PvP is inherently going to be at a severe disadvantage in terms of content to its counterpart in the video game. While each major patch reveals a new raid, some new dailies, world quests, rep grinds, and so many other things for raiders and Mythic Plus runners to sink their teeth into, PvP offers a less complex change to the game, and in fact I'd argue that the game doesn't really change too much in all of its most basic concepts. I won't say that there aren't any changes, as each expansion does change up the PvP concept of how it works. For an example of this being the Resilience Gear era versus the Legion area, which we'll get to in just a minute to talk about those. They do try to make some differences for better or for worse to keep the game of PvP feeling fresh and different from the previous expansions, but honestly it doesn't feel much different in terms of actual content. The latest and biggest update on the PvP news would likely be stated to Deepwind Gorge, and its layout being changed from the Domination/Capture the Flag hybrid to simply becoming another reskinned Arathi Basin clone. And while this did receive positive feedback, at least from most people, it isn't the groundbreaking thing that will change the way PvP works in the game and make it more viable to the average player. And that's what will bring me to my prime topic of today: viability. Viability in World of Warcraft is probably the biggest subject that I want to talk about today, as it is the absolutely biggest problem that plagues the PvP atmosphere in the video game. Here's the thing, I did several interviews with PvPers trying to get a perspective on the current environment in terms of gearing, viability to solely do PvP for gear, etc. And the guys that I did interviews with, they weren't just some random people who I found that were walking around the streets. They were actual PvPers who were at least 1.8k in arena ratings or above. So you can safely know that they had an idea of what they were talking about. I basically tried to figure out the viability of doing PvP content strictly for gearing, and they essentially told me that in terms of the current expansion, it isn't viable at all. Their gear also enforced what I was saying, as when I did inspect them over, most players, whether I got a chance to interview them or not, were wearing Mythic Plus gear, raid content gear, and other types of gear that wouldn't be reviving around PvP. The only thing that I really saw that was primarily PvP oriented was the Trinkets, which most of the interviewers agreed that the Trinkets in PvP were actually really good for that side of the video game. Well, I'm glad they figured Trinkets out. Now if only they could figure out how to make the rest of it viable. Here's the thing, World of Warcraft's PvP system has enough going against it without hitting another nail in the coffin, and in my opinion this seems like the hammer that could very well knock the nail in. You shouldn't have to run player versus environment content in order to do PvP content. And yet when I talked to people about it, they basically stated that's exactly what they do. And to that I have to ask, why? Why make it to where people have to do another side of content in order to get the best gear possible for what they actually want to do? Why make them go through the hassle of doing Mythic Plus dungeon runs when most of them would likely want more gratification getting their gear from doing battlegrounds, arenas, or something more PvP oriented in the video game? And it's not like you see the other side of the coin doing something similar for PvP. The only time I can really think of anyone who wants to go raiding and do Mythic Plus content doing something PvP oriented is if they can gather some temporary item level raising piece until they can do the higher Mythic Plus values. And that's it. And even then, that's few and far in between. This is where I personally think problems begin to end live for World of Warcraft's PvP. There's no true viability to simply and strictly doing PvP content because it's not even built for you to do so. And if you really want evidence of this, I'll go ahead and explain this even further. So one of the people I talked to actually gave me a slightly different answer than I was expecting. In their interview, they explained to me that it is actually viable to do PvP content for gearing due to the fact that you can just pick some of the stats that you want for the cap gear of PvP. They say that the trinkets are great, just like everyone else, and in the late seasons, it is in fact viable to do it. But they would later admit to me it's extremely time consuming to do, and that the gear from the dungeons is much better because of the stats that you can get from certain items. In this case, they stated that Demon Hunters had some of the best in slot items from Underrot that they could get, a big one being the weapons. But from that interview, I drew out two things that are the reason that are so viable to do PvP in the game, which is time and reward. Let's tackle time first. You see, when you play a video game where the objective is to gear up your best in slot as quickly as possible, you want to go for the quickest route to get there. The reality is PvP's time versus gearing up a Mythic Plus and raiding is significantly longer. You can get into a Mythic Plus fairly quickly. In fact, it only takes a good day to start doing low-level content that Mythic Plus has to offer. What you can't do is go straight into an arena and start gathering conquests that way in order to get viable gear in a day. On top of that, RNG plays a big role in both sides of the content for gearing, but is especially apparent on the PvP side. From what I've noticed, if you win a battleground, you're guaranteed a 430 piece with the very first one you win. That's a good start, and probably why a new level 120 would want to go in and get that particular piece. But after that, it could take several wins to get a piece from a battleground or arena skirmish, and the RNG is a lot less consistent than that of a PvP aspect of things within the video game. This means you'll be spending a lot more time grinding up for pieces in battlegrounds versus the one guy who ran regular mythics and got at least one 430 piece from each one to help them get started on the gearing path much faster. Essentially, you're doing a lot more work for a lot less reward. And that's if you win the battlegrounds. If you lose, you're basically guaranteed to not get any gear, whereas if you don't complete a keystone in time, you still do have a chance to get gear at the end regardless. To someone who is looking to gear as quick as possible so they would be on the top of their field, this would be a no-brainer to essentially go ahead and go do mythics versus the battlegrounds. Who needs to sit and play a game of win or lose battlegrounds when you can simply go into mythics and get at least one gear piece from each one? Granted, it's not 100% guaranteed it'll be the pieces you need, but the odds are still less time consuming and more favorable than going into a battleground, which leads me to my second point, reward. Gearing for PvP is so painfully obnoxious that the reward doesn't equal the time and grind put into it. Allow me to give you an example. I went to go take a look at my priest at the Call of Arms challenges that are set up on War Mode difficulty. There are some guaranteed pieces you can get by doing these quests, and depending on which one you do, they can settle for 425 and up. One of the highest ones I saw was 445. But the requirements to do such a task are going to be a true test of patience for anyone who even wants the most basic gear. To do these Call of the Arms, you need to kill 10 or 25 players, depending on which zone you're in, of the opposite faction. Now, this might not seem like such a daunting task until you realize how many people don't actually play on War Mode difficulty. Depending on your realm, you might see one player every once in a while, or you may not see anybody at all. I know when I did my dailies on War Mode, I'd tend to run into a player only every once in a while. And if I did run into someone, it was likely a 5-stack just running around and killing everyone in full decked out gear for the fun of it. This means you need to lightly gather some friends, find some people to kill if there are any at all, not only kill one of them, but kill 25 of them, and then turn in a quest for just a 425 piece. And that's just getting started. Why would you want to go through the hassle of what I'd argue is an all-day affair when you can just, again, get some 430 pieces from a Mythic or a Mythic Plus, and by extent have the gear necessary to do more content than the guy stuck trying to get 25 opposite faction members killed? Now, someone would probably argue that the time and reward grind is what WoW should be about, and to me, that's not entirely untrue. If you want to make PvP's gear more difficult to get, then that's just how it is. Ultimately, putting challenge in the video game is a good thing, as it does strive for people to have to put in effort to advance in the respective field of content they want to play. But I can't stress this enough. You can't also, in the same game, have an easier, more viable way to get gear that takes less time. That just means people will, by default, go to that side of the content instead of doing your PvP programmed quest because they know they can get more out of it. These two are very important things. Time and reward is what makes a player choose what they wish to do. And a part of the reason that I think War Mode failed is just because it isn't worth it. They wanted a big, extravagant battles to take place where killing 25 people in a day would be a cakewalk. Yet look at the zones. When you are in them, most of them are just empty, save for a few questers who are taking advantage of a War Mode buff for coalescing visions, and like I said earlier, the 5-stacks who run around and randomly kill people for fun. There isn't much that PvP offers to the player base, and therefore it makes it tough for anyone to solely want to do it alone. You can't then turn around and give people a better alternative in a different side of the game. unless that's the goal. And if it is the case, good job. You've pretty much succeeded in funneling everyone into doing Mythic Plus and raiding in order to stay competitive in both sides of your game. I personally, though, don't like the way that it currently is. So instead, I'm going to express how I think PvP should change and how we should have a more balanced system for players who strictly want to PvP for their gear. And honestly, in order to do this, we'd only have to go back a few expansions for the answer. I've said this before on live streams that I've had at twitch.tv/CamixGame, but Blizzard had a good system that was moving in the direction of what I'd want to see done for the player versus player combat. Don't get me wrong, there are some good and bad ones, and again, each season essentially gives rise to a new method of PvPing that results in meta changes. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that resilience, PvP power, or stat adjustment from legions was a good or ideal situation to me. To me, resilience gear and PvP power made it a little bit too difficult for someone to get into the PvP atmosphere, and had a sort of closed concept where unless you had the certain gear, there was no way you were going to be able to stand off against someone. It made the reward too great, and even though it matched the time versus reward standards, as I mentioned, there is a third element that I want to throw in here, and we'll call it balancing. I'll give you a little triangle on the screen to give it a reference. Balancing in this meta was really almost non-existent. You couldn't hit someone with resilience gear unless you yourself had the PvP gear, because if you tried, the damage you do wouldn't be enough to even put a dent in their HP. You may as well be a grandmother hitting them with a cane. As a result, unless you were willing to sit there and be slaughtered and carried for a few PvP battlegrounds, you essentially weren't going to get into the PvP meta. So yes, while time and reward were made real in this meta, balancing was near non-existent. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I don't think the meta that Legion introduced was a good idea either. This meta was essentially extremely balance friendly, where everything was absolutely possible. New 110s could possibly hold their own against geared paladins and death knights, and that's exactly the problem. There was no sense of reward for gearing since everyone was pretty well set on the equal playing fields. Sure, some people had advantages with gear, but it really didn't solve the problem of PvPers having to deal with mythic raiders coming in. It just went ahead and put everybody on a pedestal. And where's the fun in that? There is no sense of competition to getting better because you're already near the top, regardless of what gear score you were at. This basically takes the time and the reward system for PvP non-existent as well. Who really cares about doing PvP if everybody is just equal? There was a system, however, that I think with a little bit of tweaking could have been viable to keep around for a few expansions, even with the changes they made with the Azerite traits, talents, so on and so forth. Something that could have been useful to the player base, given a form of balance, time, and reward. That system can be found in what most consider to be the worst expansion of them all, Warlords of Draenor. Yes, I will acknowledge that the expansion is flawed in almost every single way, and that's probably why people don't look at Warlords of Draenor for positive things. But out of the dumpster fire of lackluster content, there is some positives that can be said about the way it treated PvP. You see, Warlords of Draenor introduced a concept that I think should be used to this current day, and that is the idea of gear scaling. You might be wondering what that is, if for those of you who skipped this expansion or are new to the game and have only experienced what later expansions of PvP content is like. Well, to put it simply, gear scaling is a concept where the gear is scaled up depending on what content you're doing. And they introduced this idea to the PvP as a simple way to spice things up and reward those for gearing from the PvP perspective. How they did it is simple. If you got a piece of PvP specific gear, you can use it for any content you want to. If you wanted to go into raids with it, you can do that. If you wanted to go into dungeons with it, go ahead. If you wanted to do battlegrounds, great. But here's the kicker. If you used it in a PvP setting, then that gear would scale up in item level, so that way it was more viable than just your typical low-level gear. And it did that for all PvP sets back in Warlords, so even the most basic armor, the uncommon PvP armor, would scale up to a higher item level. This meant that if you got more rare or epic gear, then the gear would scale up within the PvP situations, and then go back to the same base item level once you were done doing something like raid content or dungeons. Now you might be asking why I think this is the best case scenario for World of Warcraft's PvP system. Well, let me go ahead and take a look back at our triangle here. As you can see, we've got the rewards, time, and balancing. Let's go ahead and talk about time. Essentially, Warlords of Draenor had a method that allowed you to buy PvP gear in exchange for honor or conquest points depending on what level of difficulty of PvP that you did. This meant that it wouldn't take forever to get a full set of conquest and PvP gear, as you'd eventually be able to do it running through battlegrounds. And although this may take a little bit longer than PvE content to get, it had the reward to back it up. The reward being that if you got these pieces of gear, you were graced with a higher stats and item level when involved in PvP conflicts. You basically would want to do PvP and spend the time it takes to get said gear from the potential of having the best possible outcomes in PvP games. Then of course, you had balancing. Yes, admittedly, it would be a slight wall to some new players getting involved in the PvP world. But in reality, PvP can't be perfectly balanced down to the lowest item level in Battlegrounds, or it wouldn't be worth the reward or time to gear up in a PvP environment. Balancing here is going to be a little bit lower than the other two, but I'd argue that it should be this way in order to ensure that people can have the satisfaction of knowing they worked their way to the top, while also not having to be completely impossible to do so a la Resilience gear. So in my opinion, the best solution for the PvP gearing situation would be to go back to Warlords of Draenor, pick up some of the PvP scaling system and have it to where if you have the top PvP armor, then you get scaled to something that is better than the PvE gear of its tier. For instance, if you get epic quality gear, make sure it's slightly better than its PvE counterpart so that way people can see the value of putting time to get that gear. No one should have to do content they don't want to in order to safely play the other part of the game. It makes it a hassle for anyone looking to get involved into PvE, so make it to where it's viable to do so. It just seems odd to me that the current meta has it to where PvE is so much more viable and easy to get gear than its counterpart, and unfortunately, a lot of people based off my interviews seem to agree. But I want to know what you think. Comment down below how you feel about the PvP situation currently, and if you like this type of content, give it a like and subscribe for more. Also follow me on twitch.tv/CamixGame where I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday night. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you soon.